Hello, and welcome to the Postmodern Iconoclast. The Postmodern Iconoclast is a podcast where I break down and deconstruct the false idols and icons of the digital age in search of a more authentic, esoteric spirituality. I'm your host, Georgina Rose. I am a perennialist and polytheist. And on this episode, we're going to be talking about symbols. So, despite this being an esotericism podcast, I've had tons of people talk about the traditions they practice, their beliefs, but I actually have not done a deep dive into symbols, which feels a bit of a shame since that's kind of important. I mean, when you get into esotericism, everyone sees all these symbols. I mean, even like the normies who get into basic astrology know basic symbols. I mean, symbols are a language that we see the world through, and they're so important. And so I've got someone on who symbols is all they do. Like they're very into symbols. Can you introduce yourself, talk about who you are, what you believe, what you do, and give some info on who you are for the audience?
Yeah, for sure. So, first off, thanks for having me. My name is Mario Garza. My project is called Symbolic Studies, and I started that in 2020. So, I believe Halloween 2020 is when I put out my first video. And it basically came about because I started getting really into the world of symbolism because I'm a lifelong artist. I've been a graphic designer for 25 years, which is pretty crazy for me to say, actually. And over time, I just got really interested in wanting to know the symbolic value, say, of the different colors that I was working with or the different shapes that I tended to gravitate towards and things like that. So, about 2008 or 2009, I started buying symbolic reference books, symbolic dictionaries, and encyclopedias, and things like that. And just over the years, I collected more and more books. And so now I kind of have this nice library of reference material. And so it's really fun for me to really get into, say, an animal or a sign or a tool or an object and look at all of the different entries that I have available at my disposal to see kind of what it's all about. And over time, I got to know some of the authors that I felt like were really credible and some of the books that I tended to prefer. And over that time, I got really interested in esoteric information and the tarot and astrology and whatnot. And so I figured at some point, I should start talking about this stuff online. So I started Symbolic Studies. And if people check out my work on YouTube or Instagram or whatever, they're going to find that I spent a lot of time talking about the symbolic nature of every sign during the sign itself using the tropical system. But in my presentations, I tend to branch out of that and I talk about other constellations and things that I've become really interested in. That's pretty much everything in a nutshell. Yeah.
That's actually really cool because you started right around when I actually started posting on YouTube because I've been on Instagram a little bit in 2019, but I actually started putting out videos in August 2020. So right around the same time you did, which is quite interesting. I mean, that's
Definitely.
symbolism is everywhere in esotericism. I mean, I think learning what symbols are is actually probably one of the easiest ways to understand these concepts. Like for me, when I was learning esoteric information, the big thing I memorized was the correspondence of the planets. And then I started like seeing where those things corresponded, and that helped me understand things actually at quite a quick rate. And so I think understanding symbols is kind of a big deal in esotericism. I mean, when you look at like you learn esotericism, I mean, everyone sees those charts and those diagrams pretty early on, and those are full of symbols. And so I think understanding symbols as kind of a language of their own is so important. And to just jump into the conversation, I guess I should ask the most basic question of all: why are symbols important, and why do we gravitate towards them to express these ideas?
Right. No, that's an excellent question. And I'll say that essentially everything here is symbolic, right? So if you're talking about the language in which we use to communicate, iconography, just anything and everything here is symbolic because there's always an inherent meaning behind the thing that we're talking about. And so the way I put it, and I think that this is actually one of the best ways it's been put, it's from my current favorite author, Rene Guénon, and he basically says that symbolism is the means best adapted to the teaching of higher religious and metaphysical truths. And so it really is just like what you said. It's a language unto itself, but behind every symbol, it's completely encoded with information. And I found that on a metaphysical perspective, symbolism is kind of what bridges the gap, between the material and the spiritual, if you want to put it that way. And so I found it to be like a fundamental sort of study for me over time if I wanted to level up my sort of conscious awareness. And if I wanted to kind of grow as a person, it was something that I felt like it was just a huge calling for me. And so anything and everything can be symbolic. It's really funny when I talk to people about symbolism. There's a lot of people who don't know that this is like really a study or something that you can kind of get into. And so I found that a lot of modern people, this kind of has been lost, in the sands of time as like a study or as a pursuit or as something that's actually like valuable. It's kind of difficult too because so many different cultures have different opinions about some of the same symbols or some of the same icons and everything else. And so I think for a while, for a number of years, even though I had all of this reference material, I was still trying to figure out kind of like the hierarchy of things or kind of like what this study actually looked like and even why it was important and everything else. But I feel like over the last couple of years, I finally have like a strong foundation and I feel like I can talk about it much better. But yeah, that's why in the occult world, there are so many symbols, because they represent really, really important concepts. And in many ways, a lot of these symbols to me, as I grow as a person, I'm seeing new information encoded in some basic shapes and in some basic, symbols essentially. So hopefully that
Yeah,
answered your
no, it
question.
totally does. And I'm thinking now about that point you made about Gwenon's perspective on symbols as kind of a gateway in. I think that's very true because when it comes to metaphysical ideas, I think the general thing that I've noticed as I've understood metaphysics more is that it's often a very complicated way to explain a simple concept, but we need it to be explained in this complicated way because the simple concept is so abstract that it kind of goes above our heads, right? I think from a normal
Mm.
perspective, like learning metaphysical ideas, it's very abstract, especially as you get into more complicated stuff. And I think it genuinely is kind of hard for people to understand. And I think that's a big reason why symbols have been such a foundational teaching tool because symbols, as you were talking about graphic design, like the colors and whatnot, they speak to our subconscious, they speak to layers of our minds, our sort of ways of connecting things to each other, right? And I think it does function as a gateway into understanding these ideas that are otherwise kind of a bit unreachable without more complicated ways of getting to them. And so I think symbolism can almost kind of be like an initiator of its own from an intellectual standpoint.
Oh yeah, absolutely. No, that's a great word. Yeah, no, that I completely agree with that. And so another way of looking at it is that symbolism and these symbols, they represent a higher order essentially. And so there are higher planes of existence and there's a higher order. Gwenon goes on about this in several of his books. And so what we have here at our disposal, symbols and symbolism, it represents a higher sort of level of existence basically. And so to me that's kind of an important thing that I've really begun wrapping my head around more lately, I would say. So that's why a symbol has so much inherent value. Every single symbol is really a well of information because it's actually speaking to a higher order essentially.
Yeah, and the thing is with these kind of higher orders and layers of existence really, which is a metaphysical idea that comes up again and again and again in most religions, especially if you start looking at the more esoteric side of them. I mean, you see those really elaborate diagrams, right? Of like the chain of being, the order of being, right? There's so many of them from around the world. And I think if you don't know the symbols on those charts and you don't take the time to learn the symbols on the charts actually aren't very helpful, right? I think a good thing to do actually early on is to do a bit of symbolic study because I think it can kind of expedite the speed in which you can learn these ideas. And I mean, I think symbols they speak to us on a level where some of them we can kind of intuitively understand them, others less so. Like I think the image of say a snake, right? I think most people can just kind of intuitively understand the different things that say maybe a snake represents. But I don't know, I think they speak to us on a level that is able to penetrate our subconscious maybe in a way. What are your thoughts on that kind of idea?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely, 100%. And so that's exactly how it works. And so that is really it's the language of the ancients, I would say would be symbolism. And that's why stories are important. That's why our dreams are important, right? That's why, conveying information through folklore to me is important. The oral tradition, right? And so oftentimes when you're looking at some of these older stories that people used to pass down, it's like a story between a coyote and a raven or a frog and a scorpion or something like that, right? It's like, well, each of these animals represents, a different part of reality and an aspect of this higher order. And so symbolism to me, like I was saying earlier, like it kind of to me, it really is something that follows your own growth. So when I first started learning the tarot, excuse me, I really was like interested in all these different aspects with these cards, and some of what I learned about the cards was really really rudimentary compared to what I understand now about these cards. And so in a way it's like my awareness of the cards has grown with my sort of conscious sort of trajectory here with everything. And so one person can watch a movie. If you're a child, you can watch a movie. You can watch The Wizard of Oz or something, and then you watch it in your teens, and then you watch it in your 20s, and then you watch it when you're older. You're probably going to have a different interpretation of what's going on there, right? um, but this subconscious thing, yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where you don't even consciously know some of what you're taking in when you see a piece of art, when you're hearing a piece of music, when you're watching a film. If you suddenly see some symbol somewhere, right? It kind of speaks to our ancestral memory in a way. There's some symbols and there's some creatures where even if you've never seen it before, you kind of have an inherent understanding of it. And so I think that there's a lot of symbolism kind of baked into just who we are as humans.
That's really interesting. And when we talk about learning anything esoteric, it is that thing where you come back to it and you understand more and more. Like a lot of these big text people read, I mean, I will read them later and it'll make so much more sense to me than it did maybe even like 2 years ago.
Hmm.
And the idea of ancestral memory is quite interesting because I think people in kind of the modern mindset, right? We don't realize how much like our ancestors affect how we act, how we think. And we're getting a little bit of this coming into the consciousness with like some of those there's some like gene theories about like ancestral impacts from genes. I think it's called epigenetics. I'm not entirely sure. I'm not a scientist. But this is coming into the consciousness back a little bit, like people being like, oh, like ancestral memory, generational trauma, those type of ideas are coming in a bit. But I think in a spiritual perspective, this idea has always been held to, right? That the experience of our ancestors kind of flow through us, and we have these collective memories, and we link to sort of collective zeitgeist of a consciousness more than I think we understand. And symbols, now that I'm thinking about it, now that I'm saying this right now, like I'm thinking, I'm like, symbols kind of help us link to that sort of collective consciousness or even collective unconsciousness if you want to get Jungian about it. But that kind of way that we all link together, because what is one of the most central pillars of esoteric thought that goes throughout all traditions is the idea of like unity, all is God, those type of ideas. And I think that's quite interesting. I just that occurred to me.
Yeah, no, you're 100% right with that as well. I like what you said earlier about symbols being a sort of support or helping us in our journey. And I think that's absolutely true. And that's kind of what they're here for as well. They're almost like little pillars or something along these lines. And I've actually been really geeking out on pillar symbolism and how it relates to this concept that some people refer to as the world axis, and just kind of a prop or support. And I've made videos about this before. I think the magician card in the tarot kind of links to this, where the magician, oftentimes he's holding a wand up in the air and then he has one hand pointed down. Most people relate this to the as above, so below sort of concept. But I see it that he's kind of like a central support in a house, say a house of God, if you will. And the Hebrew letter that actually corresponds with the magician is Bet or Beth, which means house. So it's like the central pillar in the house of God. And it's not uncommon to see a tree behind him. And so the tree has kind of been viewed as like, every tree kind of symbolically is like a world tree, right? And so that trunk of a tree is almost like a support for the heavens, something along these lines, right? And symbols are there to support, right? And so every single object that is not unlike a tree, right? I would say the tower, I would say even the modern building, the standing stone. There's lots of examples of this, right? The obelisk is a good example. They're all bridges to the heavens, basically, right? And so there's a lot of stories that kind of relate to this, like Jack and the Beanstalk, right? So it's like a bridge to the heavens, a bridge to these higher realms. And I think that symbolism in this way acts as a bridge, once again, a bridge to these higher realms. So it's a support. It's a support for us to kind of, um, basically bring about our higher nature or tap into our higher nature. So I think when you said that support or a help or something along those lines, that definitely clicked with me because that's absolutely what they are.
Yeah, and if someone wanted to, they didn't have much of a knowledge of symbols or they were kind of disconnected from symbols, but they wanted to begin that kind of connection process, where should they start?
Yeah, that's a great question. The first thing I tell people is just to start paying attention. Start paying attention to what you're seeing and what you're taking in. And there's a couple of different ways of perceiving everything when you're just living your life, right? So if you are driving down a road and you see a billboard, or you're flipping through a magazine, or you're online and you see an ad, kind of trying to pierce the veil of what was the sort of intention behind this graphic, behind including, this kind of iconography. And so when you do that and you kind of put yourself in the role of the creator, I think that you actually get more from viewing all of these different things versus, say, just taking it at face value. And so I personally really enjoy deconstructing things like that. And so I really like watching a movie and then talking about it afterwards. What did the script mean? Was it shot well? Was it acted well? What were they trying to say? What are some of the implications for this film? What does it say about when it was released? Things like that. And so just kind of being in the deconstructive mode when you're just living life, basically, instead of just taking a walk and just, obviously you're encouraged to do whatever you want while you're walking on your own time, but even just observing the natural world and how animals just kind of do their thing, and kind of the nature of the bird, the nature of a fox or a deer, or the tree and the sunlight and the clouds and just everything. So I say that the first step is just paying attention and being aware. So you don't really need to go out of your way and sign up for a course or buy books to start off with, but just kind of being aware of what your senses are sort of taking in and deconstructing maybe what it might mean, on a deeper level, and paying attention. I just think that is like the first thing you can do. But for me personally, what really blew me completely wide open was the tarot. And so I thought I knew about symbolism before I got interested in the tarot. And then I got my first deck, and then I got my first book. And once I cracked open that book and started reading about the element of water and what it means and how it connects to your emotions and all these things, and I'm like, wow, this is actually very, very interesting. And so it was love at first sight for me personally. And so I have a number of decks now, and I give tarot readings and things like that. And it's just continued to like blow me away, all of the things that are encoded in the cards. And so from there, I got really interested in astrology and numerology. And, it fits with all of these other things. And so as a system for me, that is what has really allowed me to really branch out and learn about, other things. But yeah, I would say basically just, being aware is crucial to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, the tarot actually, I've been thinking about this quite a lot, because I've been thinking about my relationship to tarot and other people's relationships to tarot. And I've noticed consistently that a lot of like the way tarot is perceived, especially in the mainstream with like silly horror movies coming out about the tarot, right? It's perceived as something that's solely a fortune telling tool, which absolutely tarot is used for divination. I mean, I think we all use tarot for divination, but there is a second purpose to tarot, especially the modern tarot everyone's using, right? The one that descends from A.E. Waite. And essentially, it is that it was used as a teaching tool, right? all those symbols are in that tarot to help people understand the mysteries, especially those that descend from that kind of neo-hermetic tradition. I mean, I know people who have like gone. I believe there was a Rosicrucian group doing this for a while, where they would have people like lay out all the tarot cards and like use that to understand specific, like different symbolic systems, and basically crack into all the mysteries of Western esotericism using those tarot cards as a guide. Because yes, they're a divination tool, but they are actually designed with all those symbols to, of course, give insight into your subconscious and into the future, but also to literally teach you mysteries. Like tarot is meant to have multiple purposes and multiple functions. And I think it's kind of been reduced in its function to just a fortune telling tool, which is a shame. I mean, it's great at that, but there is so much more to it. And I think people could really benefit by doing that more and seeing the tarot as a teaching tool.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so I feel the exact same way about astrology. And so astrology for a lot of people is simply a way to forecast ahead and see what's coming down the pipeline, either for themselves or the world at large. And certainly, as you mentioned about the tarot, it can be used that way. And there are people who are very gifted in using it that way. And so I would never say that that isn't something people should do or whatever. But I see it that you can also use astrology as a way to learn about yourself, you know? And so know thyself and you'll know the universe. All of these different signs say something else about who you actually are. And there's so many beautiful lessons built into every single sign that if people start following my channel or view my work, they'll see that that is my approach, with astrology and with the symbolism associated with all the signs, is that and by learning the mythology of these signs and seeing how they have this interplay with each other and learning about the system itself, you're learning a lot of things about who you actually are and sort of your spiritual growth and awareness. And so I like to use divination systems almost like that inherently, like across the board. So even the I Ching, I think the I Ching is really interesting, but when I study it, I'm kind of using it that way too. And so I love learning about the runes as well. I see the same thing with the runes. A lot of people use it for divination purposes, and I think that's fine. But I like to learn the system because, and by learning the system, I feel like I'm gaining all this other extra information. And for me, it's really kind of what lights me up, and it's what fills my cup, basically.
Yeah, I mean, you can do so much with these divinatory systems. And astrology itself, I mean, astrology is there's so many different ways astrology has been used. I mean, there's like medical astrology, there's financial astrology, there's horary astrology. I mean, there's a lot of ways astrology can be done. A big thing I use astrology for is planetary remediation type stuff, which is a big personal interest of mine. Um, and I think, yeah, learning astrology is a really good one, actually, because if you can learn even just like the main planets and the signs, first of all, the symbolism of the planetary glyphs tells you so much about the planets themselves. Like, if you really sat with it and I think stared at the glyphs of the planets, you could kind of understand what they represent just by looking at them. Um, like with
Yeah.
Saturn, you see that scythe, right, representing all the things that Saturn has to do with.
Right.
With Mercury, you can
No,
see that
100%.
kind of
And,
it looks like it's reaching
one
upwards
great
for knowledge
example
to
of
me in a
this,
way.
I
And
just
then if you
love
look at
this
like,
little
say,
sort of insight
Sagittarius'
with the
symbol, I
glyph of
mean, it's like an
Mercury.
arrow,
And the
right?
glyph of Mercury
It's what
encodes a lot of
Sagittarius
things.
does.
And I have a
And
reverence for
people don't
Mercury.
think about it that
I
way.
think
They're just like, oh, I've got to memorize like which sign goes to which planet to which, you know what I'm saying? And there is so much baked in just the way they are drawn, that is so interesting to understand. And then, of course, with planets, what's so great about it is they are in every single correspondence system. So you can memorize the planets and then understand like all the correspondences. Get Libra 777 and just like cheat your way through. I'm kidding. You should learn things, but like there's so much in just those symbols. So, do you think it is even possible for someone to understand something like astrology without diving into what those symbols mean?
That's an excellent question. And I would say that you would be way better off if you understood the symbolism behind the signs and the depth of what these signs represent. That's one of the things actually that I have been a little concerned with, not in a major way, really, but seeing people's interpretation of the signs and what they mean. and basically kind of coming to the conclusion that there is more underneath the surface, or there's more behind that veil. And that if somebody took that pursuit seriously, I think that they would gain a lot from it. But inherently, every aspect of any part of astrology is symbolic, right? And so if you're starting to learn about Scorpio, naturally the scorpion conjures up all sorts of different things, right, in your mind. The fact that it looks like it's always fit for battle, right? Like it's going to fight at any moment. The fact that it has those claws and the stinger and everything else. The fact that it's small, the fact that it has venom, right? All of these different things, I think that you naturally are going to pick up the symbolic value of these signs. It just depends on how deep you really want to go with everything. But I think that your soul is going to appreciate, learning maybe some of these new layers of information if you were to dive into it.
Yeah, I think that to try to pursue these things without a knowledge of symbolism would be a bit of a mistake, honestly. I mean,
Hmm.
I think it would make things exponentially harder. And one thing that I think doesn't get brought up enough is that symbols can be used as a whole layer of correspondences. Like you can use symbols in specific ways because if we understand how the imagery of the symbols and the meaning of the symbols affect us, you can understand that putting things into a spiritual practice or putting things into a ritual using those symbols, it actually enriches it and adds a whole new layer. And so symbols are a tool as well as a thing to learn.
Yes. Yeah. 100%. And so I think anybody would be better off learning about the symbolism of whatever their practice is, whatever sort of, even what their religious background might be, right? So if you're someone who's a Christian and you're reading the Bible, if you understood some of the symbolism of what is actually in that book from a symbolic lens, I mean, your mind would be absolutely blown, because every single spiritual text and doctrine, like when you realize the depth of some of what they're putting out there in this material, I mean, it's completely rich in information, and it ends up becoming one of these things where you need multiple lifetimes to really decode it all. So with symbolism, I encourage people to find the thing that speaks to them. So you can't learn about all of the numbers and animals and colors and shapes and glyphs and sigils and things like that, but find something that speaks to you and just really dive into it. And I've that's essentially what I've done. And so over the years, I've had different weaves that I've gone in and out of. Right now, I'm really interested in the bear and bear symbolism. And so that's kind of a newer weave for me that's kind of been bubbling up, for a little while now. I went through a whole bull weave where I was really interested in wanting to learn everything about the bull. There's certain constellations and there's certain stars that I've really been attracted to over the years. And so finding the thing that really speaks to you, I think, is a really appropriate way to start your symbolic journey.
So do you think it would be better to pick like a set of symbols like say animals or star signs or constellations or pick like a tradition like say like decoding the symbols of the Bible? Like which of those is kind of a better gateway into symbolic understanding?
Right. I think that it depends on the person. And so it depends on how you like to learn and what really gets you going. So I think that there is value in following a tradition and in wanting to know the ins and outs of what it represents and how it relates to your life and all of that. So I think, it might be an individual sort of thing, because I definitely know people who have gone all over the map and I think that that actually suits them really well. And then I also know people who are really sort of focused, laser focused on something. And I think that works for them too. But what I would say though is that I feel like I really wanted to have solid teachers in my life. And so I didn't realize how important or how much that was pulling on me until maybe the last like 2 or 3 years. And so I felt like I was more of a lone wolf. I wanted to decode things the way I perceived them. I wanted to have a unique understanding of symbolism based on my sort of experience, even though I had a lot of reference material and things like that around. But the older I get, the more I realize that having a teacher really is such a special thing. And right now, for me, I've already brought him up, I think, a couple times, but Rene Guénon is, I think, one of the best symbolic teachers of the modern world. And I think that he brings a lot of amazing things to the table. And he is someone that I've known about for years. And actually, one of my favorite symbolic reference books, he's actually referenced more than any other author or researcher. And so that's why it was my favorite, because he absolutely basically just completely was the guy who kind of put forth a lot of information that that book would later on use. And so I think that his teachings are invaluable. So for that, he has an amazing book called Fundamental Symbols. It gets republished as Symbols of the Sacred Science. And so it's kind of like a compilation of various articles that he's written, but he has whole books, like on a specific symbol. So he has a book called The Symbolism of the Cross, right? It's really, really in depth. It just goes into cross symbolism. I really like his book about the king of the world, or the lord of the world. And he gets into king, lord, emperor symbolism and what that's really all about. And so he's someone for me that once I came across his work, I was completely blown away. It took me a while to finally get around to it, but now that I am reading his material, it's pretty much all I've been reading all year. And so if someone wants to take their symbolic sort of studies like really seriously, I would say that he's someone to look toward at some point.
I find Rene Guénon fascinating. I'm a huge fan of him. I think of all the perennialist thinkers, he is probably the best of them because he brings these things together, but in a way that is actually productive and conductive to understanding and not just feeling like a mismatch of all sorts of wild things together. He's a very wise writer. When you talk about teachers, are you talking about deep diving into someone like Gwenon, or are you talking about like seeking out like an IRL or something teacher?
No, someone like went on, someone
Right, that makes
whose
sense.
work kind of resonates with you, that you feel like you're actually getting like a foundational sort of teaching, or they're going a bit deeper than maybe someone on YouTube. Although there are really sharp people on YouTube and online, he's someone where when you actually read his work, you realize that he's like a cut above, a lot of other people who are talking about the same thing.
That makes complete sense. I just wanted to clarify because people do mean kind of different things by teacher. And so I always want to make sure that's what I figured you were saying, but you always want to make sure people are, clearly represented what they are saying.
Sure.
What do you out of all of what Rene Guénon's wrote about, what do you find about symbols that he said that is the most like interesting to you or sticks out in your mind the most?
Right. Well, I would say there is actually a very specific reason why I got into his work to begin with, because for a number of years I got really interested in Northern symbolism, and which is like kind of its own little study, and specifically the stars of the northern sky. And so this would be Ursa Major, Ursa Minor, and the Pole Star, or the North Star. And I saw that there was a lot of fascinating things being said about these stars. And so I kind of made it my own pursuit to learn as much as I can about this. And so it's been this really fascinating journey over a handful of years. But I found that there are people who might call themselves black magicians and occultists who also had this sort of interest in the northern sky. And I started reading material about the idea that the pole star, the North Star, was kind of like this gateway to the other side, right? And so I thought that was really interesting. There's a book called Stairway to Heaven by Peter Levenda, and he talks about the various traditions that basically had said the same thing. um, I know that you're a really interesting person too, because you have an understanding of all sorts of different things. But I'm not sure if you've come across Doth being corresponding to the North. But I thought that was really interesting too. That even Doth, in and of itself, this hidden Sephiroth, this Sephiroth where you cross the abyss, right, is associated with the North. And so this whole entire northern sort of thing was something that I pursued for years before I came across Ganon. But as I read material where other authors were talking about this, more and more of what I was reading pointed towards Rene Guénon, that Rene Guénon has a lot to say about this. And this gets into this subject that can be talked about at length, like, over, you can write many books about it. But basically, it seems to me that there was a large shift from polar symbolism to solar symbolism, and that today's world, there's a lot of focus on the sun. And even in modern symbolism books, you're going to see a lot of symbols be associated with the sun that I actually think is not entirely inaccurate, but that there's actually roots to some of these symbols, and that there's a history prior to the sun and maybe solar worship and things like that. And so as I started getting into this material, Guénon is actually the person that wrote about this most clearly. And so there was this large shift from polar to solar. And this polar understanding actually relates to what he calls the primordial tradition, and what these perennialists refer to as the primordial tradition. And so the way I see it and what I've heard is basically that today's astrology, the wheel of the zodiac, it's a solar based system because you're talking about the signs around the ecliptic. So people are paying attention to the path of the sun. Well, my understanding is that these signs that are the 12 signs of the zodiac, that they actually have an origin story, and their origin story comes from the northern sky. And I've come across a few books where people talk about this. And so today's sky clock has a lot to do with the path of the sun. And the primordial sky clock was actually the dippers going around the pole star. And so to me, this makes a lot of sense for a lot of different reasons. But as I wanted to level up my understanding of this polar to solar shift, Guénon was the guy. And so I started reading his stuff about it. And so to me, my biggest takeaway is that. And so if you read Fundamental Symbols, you'll hear him talk about that. And he wrote some pretty key articles about this whole entire dynamic. And so this kind of gets into a whole territory that I call symbolic transfer or symbolic shift. There are constellations and there are symbols today that people have a more modern understanding of that have roots elsewhere, basically. So I would say, arguably, I made a whole presentation about this. The Pleiades, right? The Seven Sisters. And so that's right next to Taurus, or it's right within Taurus. It's an asterism within Taurus. And so I'm pretty convinced at this point that the symbolism associated with the Pleiades was actually associated with Ursa Major, the Big Dipper. And that constellation in and of itself has so much occult information tied to it. It's pretty mind-blowing. So when I think of Guénon and sort of the most important thing that I've taken away from his work, it's that stuff. It's his information about the northern constellations and this polar dynamic, which is basically the primordial tradition, or I think you can even refer to it as the northern tradition. I think when people talk about the Typhonian tradition, there's a lot of overlap with that. So there's a lot of books out there actually that relate to this, and I put together a PDF with 27 different titles where authors get into some of this information. So people can find that on my website if they want to find out more about it.
Yeah, so that's like definitely one of the most interesting things I've heard in a while. That's fascinating. Um, and I think that the solar centricity of the modern understanding of esotericism is wild because not all mystical systems are actually as solar centric as I think we think they are. And as someone who the sun is not, of all planets, the one that fascinates me the most, I love that, and people should definitely check that out. Now, as one of my sort of last few questions, what do you think the biggest misconception people have about symbolism? Like, what are people getting wrong about symbols? Where are people making errors?
Right. Well, I'll say that from Guénon, once again, he really clarified so many things. So I kind of feel like I'm a broken record sometimes, referring to him so much. But literally, I've read like 7 of his books this year, and so he is like the person that I'm thinking about a lot. And I'm highlighting the hell out of every single book that I read of his, and doing shows on it and everything else. But what I'll say is that there is a common root to symbolism. And so it's not unlike a world tree. And so there's a large tree, just imagine a large tree with all of its branches, but there's a trunk, right, that unifies everything. And so the primordial tradition that he was talking about is essentially that there is a tradition that preceded all modern traditions, and that this tradition had a real sort of structure to it and had a real metaphysical doctrine and approach, and everything else. And so all symbols basically come from a very similar place. And so all symbols basically are in reference to what he refers to as the principle, or what he refers to as the center. And so it's this idea that everything emanates from a center and everything returns back to that same center. And so it would make sense then that if everything was once, wholly unified and was expressed from the same place, that it would all mirror or echo from which it came, basically. And so that is what he gets into with his metaphysics as well. Basically, is everything is about this symbolic center. And when you understand that, it really unlocks a whole new layer of symbolism. And you actually see how similar all of these symbols are. And so, what I've learned over time is that there is more commonality between symbols than there are differences. And that is kind of his metaphysical approach as
Yeah.
well. And so what he says basically is that with syncretism, which is what a lot of symbologists and modern astrologers kind of what they adhere to a bit, he likens it to almost, picking different things out of the ether, if you will, and trying to make connections between these different things. Under his approach, everything emanates from the same place. So you start there, you start with the center. And this has been really important to me because I found that, essentially that the center of self is connected with the center of the universe. So know thyself and you'll know the universe. And so he talks about this center and how all centers are related to each other. And so when you take in this sort of concept and you look at things through that lens, everything becomes a bit more clear. And so a lot of symbols, whether it's the tree or the mountain or the stone or the pole or whatever, so many of these symbols have an attachment to the center, the wheel, right? The wheel in and of itself, the wheel of life or the wheel of existence. It can't move, it can't spin, it can't revolve without that center, without that axle, which is basically what the northern sky symbolically represents, because the North Star is the central star in the heavens. And so it's been likened to this immutable place in the sky. So it's immutable, it's imperishable. This one star stays stationary while all of the other stars revolve around it. And so that's why it's been compared to like a gateway to heaven of sorts. So this idea of this commonality among symbols, to me, is something that I think is, maybe less understood than other things.
Yeah. I think that's really beautiful, and I think people should check that out. What is like, if you could only recommend a couple resources for people learning about symbols, which ones would you recommend?
Yeah, so I would say my favorite symbolic reference book is the Dictionary of Symbols, and it's put out by the publisher, the Penguin or Penguin Publishing. And so that's a really excellent resource. And the guys who wrote that actually reference a lot of perennialist authors. And so that's why I prefer it. And when you read, just the entries on some of the things I already mentioned, the tree and whatever, you'll see, or even the center, read about the symbolism of the center and go from there, because so many things relate back to this center, this cosmic center. And so I would definitely recommend that. And then I already mentioned it, but Fundamental Symbols by Guinan, to me, is my favorite of his books that's purely about symbolism. So I would say those two are a really, really great combo.
Yeah. I think people should definitely check those out. I've actually read one of those and it's lovely. So where can people find you? Where do you exist on the internet? If people want to see more of you.
Yeah, for sure. So people can check out symbolicstudies.com. And from there, they can find my YouTube channel and Instagram and Twitter and all that kind of stuff. I also have tarot readings available there. I have study packets available. I've got a few things that people can purchase, and I have a few services related to this. So I've done a lot of interesting things with people. People have hit me up to review their artwork, how they can make it more symbolically potent. People have asked me to do dream analysis. People have approached me to do all sorts of different things. So if anyone out there thinks I can help them with their symbolic journey, they should definitely reach out.
Lovely. People should definitely do that. I will have all of his information in the show notes and YouTube description, depending on where you are listening to this podcast. And with that, that is our show. I'm your host, Georgina Rose. You can find me under every platform under the sun under the name Dot Darling, DAAT Darling. This podcast is on YouTube and podcasting platforms, so please leave a review or like, depending on where you are. And this podcast is supported through Patreon. If you join the Patreon, you get a pre-show alongside every single show. I record a little mini episode before my guest shows up. And you get a bonus episode 8 times a year. And with that, have a nice day, evening, mid-morning, mid-afternoon, whatever time it is, wherever you are. Bye!